This seems to be the scary word in science.
Well,
and
yeah.
I think it's about time they got over this.
Yes, I think it's about time they got over it too. The problem for them is that, you know, the traditional view, which is mainly a deterministic view, says that the brain creates consciousness. And those who study consciousness have come to the conclusion that you can't, there's no way to prove that. There's really no way that you can scientifically come to that conclusion or make that statement that the brain produces consciousness. And in the study of consciousness, they call that the hard problem. The hard problem is really hard because it's impossible. You see, the hard problem is how do you take matter? How do you take gray matter, biological stuff, electrical impulses, neurons? How do you take all of this stuff that's built up, of course, out of inorganic matter? All of the gray matter is built up with things that come out of the periodic table. Plus we have enzymes and other things which are complicated things that come out of the periodic table. So you have basically an inorganic world, which is all the elements that we have, all inorganic. Out of that you build up an organic world, and this organic world produces consciousness. And the hard problem is, how does it do that? How does this brain actually create consciousness? Because when you look at all the attributes of consciousness and what it's doing and so on, it's a hard problem to justify how the brain could do that. So this hard problem of consciousness, so-called, is a really hard problem because the brain doesn't create consciousness. So trying to show that it does is a very hard problem because, you'll never solve that problem and because it's the wrong problem. And the consciousness researchers have kind of gotten there. Many of them are saying that we'll never be able to solve that problem. They see there is this unbridgeable gap between matter and thought, and they just don't know how matter can create thought. You see, that's their issue. Well, even though science says there isn't any connection here, guys, that that we have any really hard information on, scientists in general want to believe that the brain creates consciousness, because that way they don't have to deal with the world any bigger than the material world. You see, the material world is all there is. That's a fundamental belief of science. There is nothing other than the material world, which means consciousness has to be a product of, created by, the material world. As soon as you let that one go, as soon as you say consciousness is created by something other than the material world, suddenly you've opened up the floodgates to all sorts of other things, and the scientists don't want to go there. So that's why this consciousness thing is such a big deal. It's like that's the line drawn in the sand. If they give that up, that consciousness doesn't have a material cause, then they've opened the doors to lots of things that they just don't want to deal with, that they're not equipped to deal with, and that they know nothing about. And that's the scary part for them. So that's why when you talk about consciousness, you have, a set of, the old guard dogmas, or the old dogma guards, or however you want to say, the old guard that has a strong belief, which we call dogma, about the way the world works. Everything is based on material causes. So once science gets to the point that they say, well, guys, it just doesn't look like we can ever justify consciousness being based on material causes. How do material things cause thought? You see, it's a hard problem. Well, okay, rather than saying, well, when you get to the point that it just doesn't look like it's right, but you really want it to be right anyway, instead of confessing that it's just not right, you say, well, it's a hard problem. You say, you try to justify it and calling it a hard problem, and we'll solve it someday, but let's right now not think about it. Let's go on. So that's where we are as far as science and consciousness. They don't want to take that step because they'll no longer qualify as the kind of leaders in our culture that know what's going on. They'll no longer qualify as the high priests of Western culture if there's a whole lot of things that are important. Consciousness is a pretty big idea, right? That's it's not like a little thing out on the edge. That's just as big as it can be, and that will kind of take them out of that game, out of that idea that everything is physical. It'll blow up their world. So that's why. You ask, why is it about consciousness? Why is it if anybody gets up and says anything intelligent about consciousness, scientists, get upset. The skeptics start to, fly around like, buzzards. That's the reason. That's the reason why.